Happy Halloween, everyone. Welcome to Moonlight Lore. I'm your host, Jordan Hopkins. Since it's the best night of the year, I figured we would have a more relaxed episode, not pertaining to any specific topic, other than that of simple ghost stories one could find around my home province of Alberta. Now, some of these ghost stories I'm going to be telling are well known, while others may not be as famous, but they all have been documented, investigated, and deemed by the witnesses or paranormal teams to be true encounters with the paranormal. So join me in our Halloween episode as we delve into the stories of haunted Alberta. Now, this first story, I thought I'd choose it simply for the fact that I have been to this place and live fairly close to it. It's about the phantom train of Medicine Hat. It's a fairly older story that I'm not sure very many people around where I live actually know of it, so I figured it's as good enough as any to start here. One night in June of 1908, a train departed from the Medicine Hat Canadian Pacific Railway Station, heading east towards Dunmore. The train was to meet up and couple with the Spokane Flyer, a deluxe crow's nest passenger train. And aboard the train was an engineer named Bob Tuhey and a fireman named Gus Day, whose job was to stoke and shovel coal into the firebox of the locomotive. Roughly about 3 kilometers outside Medicine Hat, the track began to wind down one of the cut banks surrounding the Ross Creek Coulee. As soon as the train had rounded the corner, Tuhey and Day found themselves face to face with the headlights of an oncoming train fast approaching from the east. Tuhey shouted at Day to prepare for impact and dropped his hand to the brake valve, but it was too late. The other train was mere seconds away. Before he could crank the lever, however, the approaching train flew off the tracks parallel to theirs, and Tuhey and Day gazed in disbelief as a string of phantom coaches rushed past them. The spectral crew members in the ghost train's cab waved a greeting to the two horrified trainmen as it passed by them. As Day, who stood weak-kneed at the cab doorway, would later recount, the windows of the coaches that trailed behind the ghostly locomotive were lit with the silhouettes of passengers inside. And then suddenly, as soon as it materialized, the phantom train vanished. Tuhey and Day, who both doubted their own senses, remained silent for the rest of their shift and continued east without so much as a word to each other. In the days to come, Tuhey and Day kept their strange paranormal encounter to themselves, but after some time, Day began to relax and wrote off the incident as an experience of life, while Tuhey, on the other hand, feared that the phantom train was a premonition, foretelling something terrible was about to happen. Now unable to get the thought out of his mind, he sought the advice of a local fortune teller who predicted he would die within the next month. And now even more unnerved, Tuhey asked Day to meet with him to discuss what they had both seen. After not seeing each other for 2 weeks at this point, they were both relieved to find the other's account was identical to their own. Tuhey relayed to Day about the fortune teller's prediction and decided to take a few days off work to go visit friends and family a couple hours away in Lethbridge. Day, on the other hand, wasn't quite ready to give up some of his shifts, so he continued working. A few nights later, Day was assigned to a job identical to the one that he and Tuhey had worked on before. In the exact same engine, Day was to travel east from the station, couple with the Spokane Flyer in Dunmore, and then proceed west to the Crow's Nest Pass again. This time, he was accompanied by another engineer named Jay Nicholson. That night, just as the engine rounded the corner in the Ross Creek Coulee in the same spot before, the phantom train appeared again, with its whistle blowing and headlights shining. And just as before, the train sped past on invisible parallel tracks, with the ghostly crew members waving greetings from their positions in the cab and the cars. Before Nicholson could react or knew what was happening, the train had disappeared into the dark prairie night. On the morning of July 8th, Nicholson boarded the same locomotive that he had operated with Day when they had witnessed the ghost train. He was accompanied by the fireman H. Thompson, and Day, who was usually the fireman on that locomotive, had been assigned to yard service that day. Just as before, the locomotive was scheduled to travel east to Dunmore to couple with the Spokane Flyer and head west into the Crow's Nest Pass. When the train was about 100 yards from the location on which the phantom train had been spotted on those 2 different nights, another train appeared around the bend. Only this time, it was daylight, and it was a real train. The oncoming train was the number 514 passenger train from Lethbridge, and the engineer at the throttle was none other than Bob Toohey, who had overcome his fears a couple days before and had returned to work. The 2 trains had been moving too fast with no time to brake and collided on the track. Both Toohey and Nicholson died upon impact, along with a fireman named Gray, a conductor named Macleod, and 7 passengers aboard the passenger train. Thompson was lucky and had leaped from the moving train just in time, but in total, 11 people died in that crash. If your morbid curiosity gets the better of you, and you want to see what the train collision looked like, I will have a picture I found in some archives that showed the 2 trains after the collision on the podcast's Instagram page. Moving along now to one of Alberta's more popular and well-known destinations, Banff is often known as one of the more picturesque places visitors will be drawn to when visiting Alberta and its Rocky Mountain range. Visitors may wish to spend a day or 2 in the city to take part in many of the hiking trails or ski resorts, but many may be unaware of the hauntings that go on in the popular Fairmont Banff Springs Hotel, which hosts more than its fair share of spectral residents. Opening in the late 1880s, the hotel has become an incredible sight to behold, even after setbacks including fires, redesigns and renovations, and of course, the occasional ghost story. The hotel has been compared to a giant castle by its guests and visitors to the town. Of course, with being so old and having so many people come and go through the doors, many people suspect some of the guests decided to make this place their permanent home in the afterlife. But ghosts aren't the only strange topic when people talk about this hotel. Many people often speak of a missing part of the hotel, known as room 873. As told, the story goes that decades ago, a small family of 3, a father, mother, and daughter, stayed in room 873. For whatever reason, it's believed that the father had gone mad and murdered his family in that room, and soon after, it was quickly refurbished and booked to travelers again a short while later. Soon after the first few guests stayed in the room, reports coming down to the front desk started pouring in, as guests would claim after they had fallen asleep, they were awoken by hollow screams and would find bloody handprints left on the mirrors inside the room. By the time the staff would respond and get into the room, it would be eerily silent and cold, and the handprints had disappeared. And now, after multiple complaints and rumors starting to spread, the owners decided to try and cover up the story, and the room was sealed by thin drywall, flush with the hallway to look as if there was no room there at all. And now, years later, there is doubt now if the story was true in any way, and those who have been curious have taken it upon themselves to go to the hotel and investigate. What many people have found is that every floor, except for the 8th floor, has a room ending with 73. When walking down the halls of the hotel, there are lights above each doorway. There is still one above where the missing room 873's door would have been. And finally, those with sharper eyes can notice the baseboard is cut right where the door should have been. Those who go down the hall and knock on the walls, they will find it's made of a thick plaster, though when one reaches the empty wall where 873 is supposed to be, your knocks will suddenly become hollow right under the supposed doorway light. And if you measure out the knocks, you can find the hollowness is the same length of the other doors in the hall. So there might be some truth to this story. I've never been to the hotel before, so I couldn't say if there are ghosts in room 873, But if there are, they've been trapped inside that room for a very long time and are most likely not too happy about it. But this hotel's story of hauntings is far from over though. There's a story people quite enjoy about a bellman named Sam. Sam McCauley, an old Scotsman who was head bellman at the hotel in the 60s and 70s, has been a topic of ghostly encounters since his passing in 1975. What makes this ghost story one people rather enjoy is the fact that Sam is more of a helpful and kind spirit, and majority of the stories involving him mention he still provides service to staff or guests who may need it. One story involving two elderly ladies who got locked out of their room called the front bell desk for assistance. They were told they would need to wait for a bit as their regular bellman was occupied with other duties at the moment and couldn't respond right away. When the bellman finally arrived, he found the two old ladies were both happily back in their unlocked room. And when he asked about how they got in there, they responded saying an older bellman with a plaid jacket matching Sam's description exactly came and unlocked the door for them. Other stories include guests seeing Sam haunting mainly the 9th floor, but as he was one to do in life, he occasionally makes his rounds through the hotel, opening random doors for guests or even helping with their bags. Oftentimes, people are delighted such a kind and caring spirit is there looking out for everyone. Our last tale I'll share about the hotel will take us into a more somber, but probably also the more famous story the hotel offers. People claim they see the ghostly figure of a bride walking up the curved staircase or dancing in the Cascade Ballroom in the evenings. It's said, before her wedding had even begun, she was walking up the staircase but had tripped on her own wedding gown, causing her to fall down the stairs and to her death. Another story of how she died was her wedding gown had caught fire from walking by a nearby candle while walking up the stairs, but regardless of how it happened, everyone seems to agree that she had somehow fallen and died on those stairs. What makes this story so well known is the amount of staff and guests who claim to see her figure walking up the staircase. It's gotten so common, the Ghost Bride even has her own collector's coin and stamp from the Royal Canadian Mint. So is the Fairmont Springs Hotel in Banff really haunted? Well, this is certainly one place you are more than welcome to stay at and find out for yourself. Next on our haunted tour of Alberta, we're heading to one of the oldest towns in the province, Fort Macleod, and more specifically to the Empress Theatre there. Not only is the Empress Theatre the oldest theatre in the province, it's also one of the longest still operating theatres in all of Canada, and of course, it hosts many ghost stories. In 1910, construction on the Empress started, and the 450-seat brick and sandstone theatre was built with the future in mind in hopes that the town would grow and fill out the theatre eventually. Construction was completed in 1912 to become an opera house, but also featured live concerts and performances, silent films, and then the more popular movies with sound. The theatre came to be owned by a few different men, but was eventually passed on to Dan Boyle, who ran the theatre from the end of the Great Depression to his death in 1963. Ever since the 60s, rumors of the theatre being haunted began circulating through the community, and new owners did their best to discourage any rumors and fear that the stories would scare away potential customers. In the 1980s, renovations on the theatre had begun to update and preserve its history, but this, however, also amped up the paranormal activity in the theatre, it seems. The earliest indication that the renovations were stirring up ghosts of the past was when the work had just begun. To keep the building safe and to keep out intruders, a security company had installed motion detector alarms around the outside and inside of the theater. Alarms started going off in the late hours and very early mornings every night and day, causing the police to head to the theater to investigate. Eventually, the alarms were going off so often and no intruder ever being found, the police chalked it up to the alarms being faulty. The workers, however, chalked it up to the paranormal. Another event during this time that caused people to step back and really wonder what was going on at the theater involved a member of the Great West Theatre Company, J. Russell. Russell was alone in the theater and decided to take a walk around to admire the building. He made his way along the hallway leading from the lobby down towards the old staircase and into the old basement. From what I read, this was the area where the old dressing rooms were, as there wasn't a proper green room in place for the actors and performers to stay in, so they were made to wait by the boiler room for their turn on stage. And beside the boiler room, there was another door, made of steel, which was known as the swamp cooler room because of the terrible smell water seepage produced inside. The door was heavy, and was latched shut from the boiler room side, which was also the only light source the cooler room had, as there wasn't any electricity wired on the inside. Jack Russell approached the room, interested to see what hidden treasures might have been inside, as he knew it was also doubled as a storage room for a few items. When Russell peeked his head into the darkened room, he saw an old disassembled organ sitting in the far corner of the room, and curious, he wanted a closer look at the old instrument, so he propped the big steel door open and walked inside. He recalls his experience in that room like this. I reached into the dark, and it was getting darker and darker, and I had my hand extended out trying to reach this old keyboard, or whatever it is. And just as I touched it, there came a big laugh behind me, like someone was pulling the funniest joke in the world on me. It wasn't spooky, it was just this big belly laugh, and all of a sudden, the prop on my door was gone, and the door slammed shut. And then thump, 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 up the stairs. Someone was laughing and running up the stairs. For over an hour, Russell remained locked inside the room, waiting for anyone to come to his rescue. At first, he thought someone in the theater was just playing a joke on him, but he realized after the first few minutes, no one would have left him in such a place for so long. He also thought to remember the main floor and stairs coming down to the basement were extremely creaky, but he hadn't heard anyone come down the stairs after him. Jim Layton was hired on by management in 1989 to wax and scuff the floors, vacuum the carpet, and overall clean up the theater every night after the theatergoers had left that evening. Oftentimes he was left alone in the theater to clean up and lock up afterwards. One night when he was finishing up, Layton took a break in the green room downstairs to read a magazine while he waited for the floors to dry, when he was abruptly interrupted by a noise he heard coming from up the stairs on the main floor by the doors. Believing someone might be trying to break into the theater, he walked up the stairs to check the lobby and the doors, but there was no signs of anyone around. The next night, Layton decided instead of sitting in the more comfortable green room to wait for the floors to dry, he would wait in one of the seats in the lobby to see if he could catch what was trying to open the doors the other night. When he was sitting in the lobby waiting, he heard more noises, but now it was coming from the green room. Layton said, "I don't get scared very easily, but I was out of there really quick those 2 nights." Probably the most famous spirit story coming out of the Empress Theater is the story of Ed, who used to work at the theater as a janitor in the 1930s. Ed was a large burly man who worked a second job at the Macleod auction house, where he worked with cattle for hours. Many people at the theater who encounter this specter mainly know him by his smell. And it's said if you find the air begins to smell like cigar smoke or cattle manure, Ed is surely nearby. It's rare that one can actually see him, but there have been instances of him appearing to those in need. A story of 2 young women were late to a showing they really wanted to see, but unfortunately, time had slipped away and they got to the theater a few minutes after the showing had already started. When they approached the theater, they were surprised to see the ticket booth was still open and someone was still inside selling tickets. They were met with a large, older man wearing a cowboy hat who graciously sold them their 2 tickets. And when their show had ended, the 2 women came out into the lobby to look for the man who sold them the tickets to thank him. The woman who was now working in the booth told them both she had been the only one working the booth that night and didn't remember selling the 2 their tickets. The young women then produced their tickets, which were the correct stubs, and when checking the register, the proper amount of money was in there. The 2 women described the man to the lady working the booth, but she didn't know anyone like that who was currently working at the theater. Ed would keep showing up in obscure places throughout the theater's time. Women reported seeing a large man with hairy arms in the bathroom, people looking into mirrors and seeing Ed's figure standing behind them, and the occasional passing through the crowd unnoticed when other people weren't paying enough attention, aside from a few keen observers. Ed just seems to be more of a helpful spirit who tends to keep to himself at the most part, but he does seem to have his flaws. For someone who used to be the janitor of the theater, people say he can make quite the mess. For instance, when volunteers at the theater are cleaning up and throwing trash into the garbage bin for the night, they will return the following morning to find it had been thrown all about the theater, needing to be picked up again. People honestly believe Ed is enjoying his afterlife by not only being a kind spirit, but also being a bit of a prankster one too, which might explain what happened to Jay Russell when he was locked in the basement and heard laughing coming from no one. Perhaps all the life coming and going through the theater, all the energy the actors put into their performances, and the fact that the theater has been a place of enjoyment and entertainment for the community for over 100 years could have led a spirit or two to want to make the Empress Theater their permanent residence in the afterlife, basking in the lively crowds and the lights of the shows. Our next stop on the haunted tour of Alberta is the Dean House in Calgary, often considered by so many as one of the most haunted houses in the country. It's now one of Calgary's top restaurants, located in Inglewood. The building was originally built in 1906 for Richard Burton Dean, the superintendent of the Royal Northwest Mounted Police of Fort Calgary, and his wife, who unfortunately died of an undisclosed illness before its finished construction. The house later became a boarding house during the Great Depression in the 1930s and started its history of being related to anger, despair, and horror, with stories coming out through the years of the house being related to murder, suicide, and accidental death. Now, there are multiple different stories of the house regarding the death of individuals who have stayed there in the past, with stories of a man fatally falling down the staircase, a woman jumping to her death from the second-story window, a young man being gunned down on the porch, and a boy staying at the house being bullied and tormented so much by his peers, he became depressed and committed suicide in the attic. There are a few more of these tales coming from the home people believe to be fact, but with very little evidence for most of the stories like these, the Calgary Association of Paranormal Investigators, who looked into the history and investigated the house, believe more than a few of these stories are just urban myths. Though their claim of a lot of the stories might be in the false category, they firmly stated they do believe the house is definitely haunted. During their investigation, they found too many random and unexplainable events, sounds, and witnesses claiming to have seen some form of paranormal activity for the house to not be considered extremely haunted. There is one case, however, which is documented to have truly happened, but quite honestly, multiple sources online are conflicting with the time, as sources who specifically investigate the paranormal and its history say it happened in 1952, but the Calgary Herald, the city's newspaper/website, which has only covered a quick paragraph or two about the house, saying it happened in 1971. So right now I'm a bit inclined to believe the paranormal investigators who say it happened in 1952. But as the story goes, in 1952, a tenant of the house named Roderick Umperville lost it one night and stabbed his wife Irma with a knife. As she screamed, their children came running to see what was happening, and when they entered the room, they saw their father standing over their mother, blood covering both of them, and Roderick strangling Irma. The children were witnesses to both their mother's death and immediately after, their father committing suicide in front of them. In the same house, but in a much less tragic way, the owner who also lived in the house passed away due to natural causes in 1968. From what I have read, he sounds to be one of the last people to have fully lived in the house, because a short time after, in 1973, the house became a host to a gallery and then an art studio for local artists. Then in 1978, it was designated a registered provincial historic site. But nowadays, it's known as a fine dining restaurant and wedding space for locals and visitors to come and enjoy the newly renovated building in all its glory. However, with its new design and new life, this hasn't stopped the paranormal activity from making itself known to the patrons or staff. One of the first real cases of unexplainable happenings in the building is the famous story of an old telephone in the building occasionally ringing with no one on the other end. This itself wouldn't be so weird, only the phone isn't connected to any phone line, nor does the phone have any proper wiring inside. It physically cannot work, but still somehow does. Visitors and staff members oftentimes claim to hear disembodied voices coming from empty rooms, or whispers just behind their shoulder, footsteps coming down the hall or from the second floor above. But a big thing people are claiming to notice is the smell of cigar smoke and the antique piano playing itself night and day, but when somebody goes to investigate it, the piano stops playing as soon as the person enters the room it's in. The staff have also reported dark apparitions walking throughout the building, with some strange occurrences being a pair of missing legs below the knee, floating down the stairs, and then disappearing once they get to the main floor. And we of course also have the cliché horror movie trope of bloodstains appearing in the attic where the young boy hung himself. The staff have tried locking up the closet door where the stain sits, but somehow the door constantly unlocks itself and opens up. When that doesn't work, scrubbing the stain clean was the next step. It would work for a few hours, but slowly, the stain would start to reappear, and by the next day, the floor would be back to red stained. In one story, a woman who was down in the basement looking for any clues of paranormal activity said she witnessed the spectral body of a Native American man appear out of the dark corner and screamed at her, and that she was on sacred ground and had to leave immediately. Since then, various other incidents revolving around the Native American man have come forth as patrons and staff continue to see him appear sitting in a chair, smoking a pipe, or walking down the halls. According to the Calgary Herald, a few decades ago, a psychic took a tour of the house as part of a paranormal investigation to see if the souls of the past were still trapped inside the house. As she walked throughout the house, she described the experience as terrifying. After her walkthrough, she says, "As I walked through the front door, it felt like I was walking on jello, and then I'm actually witnessing the murder. Right before my eyes, I saw a man chasing a woman with an axe. Then he bludgeoned her to death with it." As Calgary's most haunted, and one of Canada's most haunted houses, with all the witness statements from the staff and patrons, and multiple paranormal investigations finding positive readings of ghostly activity, I think we can safely assume the Dean House is one place paranormal enthusiasts need to visit. On our last stop of the Haunted Alberta tour, we head further up north to Edmonton and to the abandoned Charles Camsell Hospital, one of Edmonton's most haunted location thanks to its dark and sad past. Now condemned and abandoned in 1996 due to asbestos, local residents of the neighborhood surrounding the old hospital get an eyeful of the towering, dark, and ominous building every day as they drive by. Some say as they walk or drive by, they feel the eyes of something unknown staring at them from the upper windows. Unfortunately, paranormal investigation teams can't enter the premises anymore, as for the past few years, the building has been cleared of asbestos and is slowly being turned into apartment condos. But luckily, one doesn't need to enter the old hospital to appreciate the stories and dark history that come out of there. The building was originally used as a military base for US Army soldiers when they were building the Alaskan Highway during World War II, and served as a military hospital for servicemen with tuberculosis and other respiratory issues. But in 1946, the hospital was turned into what was called the Indian Sanatorium by the federal government. This was the start to the hospital's darker days, with the indigenous population being the victims of horrific medical procedures and forced cultural assimilation. During this time, the government organized what was called X-ray tours to distant and remote indigenous communities to look for potential patients who were discovered to have tuberculosis. All who were found to have the disease were involuntarily shipped to Charles Camsell Hospital to begin treatment. This included men, women, children, and babies, many of which never returned home. As the rumors go, most of the patients were subjected to electric shock therapy, forced sterilizations, gruesome surgeries, and even cruel dietary restrictions. Not only this, but the patients of the hospital then underwent mass assimilation as the staff influenced a non-native cultural lifestyle on everyone. Needless to say, the horrific conditions these poor people suffered through were nothing but cruel torture. It's also needless to say that many of the people brought to the hospital never made it back home. This included their bodies after death. With so many patients coming from up north in Canada's frozen territories, bothering to return a patient's body to their home for a proper burial was considered a waste of time, money, and resources. Many of the patients were then just buried in the St. Albert Cemetery by the residential school near the outskirts of the city, where a small stone memorial stands with 98 names of those who had died in the hospital. The ages vary between newborns to patients in their 70s. With the patients ripped from their homes, only to be subjected to horrific medical practices, undergo forced assimilation, and then buried in a mass grave away from their family and away from home, many people say there is more than enough reasons for ghosts of the patients who stayed at the hospital to still be trapped inside, haunting the building, looking for their families they were never able to see again. Before its recent construction started, visitors to the hospital wanting to investigate the building have come out saying from the time they took their first steps into the building, they were immediately met with a feeling of discomfort and sadness. Urban legends coming from the building say you can hear the voices and screams of former patients from the upper floors, along with the occasional disembodied footsteps all throughout the building. Old doors swinging open and closed, old hospital equipment left in the building like wheelchairs or carts would move by themselves, and shadowy figures darting in and out of the rooms. One could easily find all sorts of paranormal activity in the old dark rooms and halls of this hospital. And now, as I've said, the old hospital has been cleared of asbestos and is currently under renovations and constructions to turn it into a housing complex. Would-be visitors, trespassers, or ghost hunters will be met with a large fence surrounding the whole property, with security personnel making rounds at all hours of the day and night to deter anyone thinking of investigating the building. From what I've read, I haven't been able to find information on if the security or construction workers have encountered more ghostly activity, but I'm sure once the renovations are done and people start moving in, we'll start to hear plenty more ghost stories coming out of the Charles Campsell Hospital. I hope you guys enjoyed this Halloween special as much as I did creating it. There are so many more stories involving haunted places here in Alberta, and it was very difficult to narrow down just 5 to share here, but I think the variety of stories were a good start. Perhaps in the future I'll decide to cover more haunted locations in my home province, but in the meantime, I would love to hear about your local ghost story from wherever you, the listener, might be. You can send me a story you have, or what you have heard, by sending me an email at moonlightlorepodcast@gmail.com. And if you enjoyed listening to this episode, please feel free to leave a 5-star review on whatever app you're listening on. And if you want to help the podcast grow, mention it to a friend or family member who you think might also enjoy hearing these stories. Thank you all for listening to the podcast, and do stay safe during this Halloween season. I'll see you next time.